There's a thin line between failure and success. And talents are great, whether it's exceptional intelligence or above average athleticism, they can get you close, if not right up to that line. But mentorship, representation, and exposure to opportunity, those are the only elements that are going to get you across that thin yet certainly hardened line between the two. I was very fortunate to have gotten advice to seek mentors constantly, and that the kind of mentor I would need would change over time. So I've had many along the way that have played different roles in different points in my life, whether it was as a freshman at the academy with James Hall or Harvey White or Jasmine Petty, on to becoming a senior and getting my pilot slot and finding older grads like Glenn Gonzalez. The first bit of help he gave me was representation. So he showed up on a random picture on my Facebook feed through my network of friends at the time, and I saw him standing in front of his F-15 being black and tall with hair like mine. And so I shot him a message and I said, hey, I want to be just like you 2 or 3 years from now. How do I do that? He acknowledged me, and he gave me step-by-step advice for the next 3 to 4 years about how exactly I could do what he was doing right then and there.
Our objectives are simple. We want to be a positive impact on our community. We want to make sure we're bringing in a qualified pool of minority cadets. We want to make sure those cadets graduate, and then we want to help them in their careers going forward. It's much easier to get through life when you have someone that is already where you want to go. The most inspirational moments come when you see a relationship blossom and you see different people take off in different directions that they otherwise would not have. One of the biggest things that you can have as a young person or as a young cadet is exposure. We offer multiple different ways for cadets to get together. For example, our annual Chuck Bush Conference. It's a way to get all of our graduates back and to get all of our cadets in the same room. So we expose people to different career fields, different individuals that they otherwise probably wouldn't have had a chance to meet and get to know each other.
Coming from an underprivileged school in Philadelphia where they related to my background, but not necessarily my goals and aspirations. So switching over to the Air Force Academy, where everyone related to my life aspirations, but not necessarily who I am, and couldn't relate to me as a human. Way of Life actually helped me out with that. After a while, I didn't even really worry about the culture shock because I had my home through WOL and the people in it. To be in this position to help cadets has been amazing experiences. I get phone calls all the time once they meet us at these events. So it's merely exposure and putting yourself out there. And then cadets have access and they see someone that looks like you and act like you and could possibly be you in a sense of your career.
You face a lot of challenges at the Air Force Academy. You face a lot of challenges in life. So to have someone to help you through tough times or times where you just have a simple question could make and break a career.
Hi, my name is Lloyd Bradley, USAPA class of 2014 and current Way of Life Alumni Group President. Thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening. Ahmaud Arbery, Christian Taylor, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many more names that will forever be etched in our memories. It is time we all pause and take a moment to have the difficult and uncomfortable conversations. To ignore the cries of help from voices least heard is negligent. On this historic day, Juneteenth, we aim to listen beyond the echoes of voices that sound like ours and work with everyone to find systematic solutions to a systemic problem. Leading the charge in change is not new to the military of the United States Air Force. We pride ourselves in one of our most favorite sayings: adaptability is the key to air power. It is who we are. We have a strong heritage of innovation and leadership, coupled with a proven history of progressive works in advancing the diversity of our forces and the nation we protect. We have never shied away from history's call to do the right thing for the right reason, now is a time when history makes such a call again. Today, we will have the tough conversation. Our distinguished panelists will address many of the questions you have asked and offer actionable items we can take along with us to fix problems that are prevalent in our society and our military. We accept and second the superintendent's call to acknowledge, take action, and advocate for change. To start our conversation, it is my pleasure to introduce one of our most senior and esteemed African-American graduates, Fletcher Flash Wiley, 2019 Distinguished Graduate and class of 1965. Over to you, Flash. We're having a few technical difficulties, so we will go ahead and introduce our moderator for this evening. Rashad Howard, class of 2001, is an entrepreneur who is truly dedicated to the development of our institution. He is truly invested in our academy. He serves as a supporting director of the Air Force Academy's Foundation. Without further ado, over to you, Rashad.
Thank you, Lloyd. And actually, I see Flash has joined us again. And so, sir, if you could come off of mute, I see you're still on mute. We see you flashing the amazing smile for us all. But if you could come off mute on your camera, then we can hear you and you can please give your remarks. And I'll stand by for you.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, good. So I'll start again, and I'll again to try to be brief. I want to say good evening to my brothers and sisters in the long black and blue line. It is indeed exhilarating to be here with so many of you tonight. I'd like to begin by thanking the officers and the board of the Way of Life organization and the organizers of this event for being given the honor and the privilege to make a few opening comments. In my mind, the Way of Life is the natural evolutionary emanation of an idea that began among Blacks at the Air Force Academy with the Soul Brothers of the class of '65. When we arrived, there were already 4 brothers there, and given our common struggles as Black people, the 6 of us expected to be warmly welcomed by our predecessors with the offer of support and assistance. Rather, so as to not appear influenced by racial favoritism, Messrs. Bush, Payne, and Gregory treated us like they did all the other cadets, and they insisted upon us earning our respective ways. So without a helping hand or a friendly word, we started helping each other. And it helped us get through an impressive system. After recognition, BGs 1 through 4 came around to congratulate us. And on our watch as upperclassmen, we decided to proceed another way. Starting with the class of '66, we made a point of making ourselves known to them and with our availability to assist them over the rough spots academically and militarily. We did not coddle them, but we were their big brothers to give them a helping hand. Our last class of brothers that we trained was the class of '68, and we hope that our legacy would be Blacks helping Blacks on and on to get in, to stay in at the academy, and continuing thereafter throughout life, because as all of you know, life is a team sport. Before I go any further, I want to give a shout out to Richard Hall and his colleagues who embraced the ideas and spent so much time and effort in getting us organized and conferring initially. Now we have utilized that strong platform and example they have set for us to evolve to yet a higher level of inclusion, proficiency, mission awareness, and determination. Thank you.
Thank you for those words, sir. And something that Flash did not mention as he spoke a moment ago is that back in April around Founders Day, he was to be inducted as a distinguished graduate of the United States Air Force Academy. And for that, he's continued to be a trailblazer and a hero for many of us, setting the
Thank
stage
you.
for all of us who've been able to come behind him. And so thank you for your remarks and your words. Thank you for your dedication to creating this space for us.
We're all brothers and sisters.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So with that, I'll take it and begin to introduce the rest of the panelists. But before I get started, I do want to say this. We have across the board some amazing people who we're joined by today. For me, one of the things that I always longed for as someone who was at the Academy was an opportunity to understand who were the people who came before me, and that ability to sort of connect and engage with them in such a way that I knew that I would be okay. And that if I could have these pioneers in front of me, I knew that all of the work, all of the playing of the games, all of the training, all of the trauma, all of it wouldn't be in vain. And with us today, we have exactly that. First on the list, I'll talk about T. Thompson. 1973 graduate, T. Thompson was the first African-American from South Carolina to receive an appointment to the United States Air Force Academy, and excelled at the Academy in leadership, including serving on the Cadet Wing staff. He was instrumental in establishing the Minority Affairs Division of the Registrar's Office and became one of the first lieutenants to recruit minority candidates to the Academy. He would go on to become a decorated Air Force instructor pilot, an international check captain for Delta Airlines, lawyer, entrepreneur, and government official. With that, we have T. Thompson. One other quick fact, he was also the CEO of the Air Force Academy Association of Graduates. One other quick thing. Next up, we also have Kate Smith. Kate served as an acquisition officer in the United States Air Force after graduating from the Air Force Academy in 1982. She's a proven leader and problem solver and has worked primarily in aerospace and telecommunication industries. Most recently, Kate facilitated small group sessions to bridge the gap between cops and kids in forums across Denver and advised the cadet squadron on ethics and honor. She's a member of the Truman National Security Project, the director of advocacy for Zaza, Zoomies Against Sexual Assault, and an Emerge Colorado alum. She's a Notre Dame lawyer. Currently, she's organizer with the grassroots veterans organization, Common Defense, and a professional storyteller. Kate Smith. Next up, we have Ed Hopkins, United States Air Force Academy class of 1995. Ed is a data security, workplace privacy, and business litigation attorney in Denver, Colorado, who will soon be joining on Monday as a partner with Fisher Phillips LLP. Fisher Phillips is one of the largest firms in the U.S. trade secrets practice groups. It's one of the largest firms representing management and labor, civil rights, employee benefits, and immigration law. Ed helps business leaders assess, improve, design, and implement data privacy management programs that comply with state, federal, and international privacy laws. He served as an admissions officer for the United States Air Force Academy from 1995 to 1996 and helped 26 diverse candidates compete for and secure Academy scholarship offers. He's rated the top performer in his department. Ed's supervising officer selected him to train the incoming group of 8 admissions officers that replaced his group. Ed Hopkins. And I myself am Rashad Howard, an entrepreneur living in the Washington, D.C. area, building a company that's dedicated to emerging technology. And so let's get started. The last few months, particularly if we look at the beginning of 2020 till now, I see a lot of people jokingly say that they want a do-over. They want to move past this year. So much has happened in this short period of time. We've had the onslaught of a global pandemic with COVID-19. which has forced us all into our homes, stay at home, stay away from people, and created a sense of isolation amongst many of us. Right at the tail end of that, as we thought that we would start to open up the United States some more and people would start to get out and enjoy the sun and family time and spring, all of those things, we had the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, the murder of Breonna Taylor, the murder of George Floyd. George Floyd in particular caused a significant uproar to the extent that we see cities burning early, and then we saw a great rally around protest to try to change the systemic issues that exist in our country. With that, I always remembered as an Air Force officer, when things like that would happen, I saw myself as somewhat torn because I'd pledged an oath to this country, pledged an oath that said that I would take the obligation freely without any mental reservation. And I was always personally in a space where I felt like things were happening around me that in some way, shape, or form made me feel as an Air Force officer counter to the things that I supported. And so with that, I want to turn it over to our panelists and just ask to start this off. How is everyone feeling given what is happening today? Where are you? How do you feel? And I'll start with you, Kate.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join. And I'm sad and I'm angry because I too took that same oath. I took it again when I became an attorney, and that oath never expired. And I'm still waiting for our country to live up to its promise. And so we are not free until all of us are free. And so every time I see police brutality on our streets, I sigh and I'm thankful that it didn't happen to me. I don't know another person, Black person, who hasn't had an encounter with the police where you feared for your life. 30 plus years ago, I was stopped by the police. They drew their weapons. And all I had done was live in my condominium while Black, and my neighbor had called the police on me. So I'm sad and I'm angry, and yet I'm seeing so many people who are caring and trying to make a difference and reaching out to their brothers and sisters. So I'm sad, but I'm hopeful.
T. Thompson, sir. T, you're on mute.
There we go. Thought I clicked it. I'm going to answer your question, but let me as well thank the Way of Life Committee, the Alumni Committee, for all the work that they've done in pulling this together. Joy and Lloyd, particularly Doc Colvin, and everyone that's had an opportunity to have a part of the effort to bring us together this evening. How do I feel? Disgusted with what has happened more recently. Understanding that we have a long way to go in this country, but yet understanding and realizing that we've come a long way. I'm getting to be an older guy, not quite as old as you, Flash, but I went to high school in 1965. My first day of high school, I went with Federal Marshal and State Trooper escort, as I was in a small group of African-American kids, 12 of us out of a student body of 1,200, to integrate what had been an all-white high school in the Deep South. We've come a long way since then, but it's clear from more recent newsworthy events that we've still got a long way to go.
Thank you, sir. Ed Hopkins.
I'd like to reiterate, like Kate and T, how much I appreciate you all putting this together. This is so needed. And maybe we can do this more frequently, right? So maybe let's not let this be the last time we get together like this. How do I feel? I'm as patriotic as I've ever been, but I am disappointed, angry with my leadership. And I'm not just talking about leadership at the federal level. I'm talking about leadership in all the powerful institutions. Leadership is the reason why things go well, and it's the reason why things fall apart. So I think that when I see what has been happening and how the world has reacted to it, what we are facing is a crisis of leadership. And I do wish that while we are out there on the street, in the streets, protesting, I do hope that the folks who are leaders and the folks who aspire to be leaders, that they're listening. They're listening to what is being said in those streets. Because in America, if you are going to lead, you need to understand and hear the people in those streets. So I'm hopeful, still as patriotic as ever, but I am shocked at how much work is still left to do in 2020.
Thank you. Thank you all for those comments. And so with that, I'll kind of push to the conversation. And Kate, I think I'm going to begin with you as well. We all had a chance to express how we felt, but we know that there are plenty of airmen who have to do this work every day, others who are in the military, those who are cadets, military officers. We had an opportunity to hear from the Air Force's new Chief of Staff, CQ Brown, to talk about what he's thinking and talk about his experiences. How do we empower airmen today? How do we empower airmen who are dealing with their own feelings, their own emotions? What sort of things do we need to see? How do they deal with it? And then how do they hold their leadership accountable through that?
Thank you. I've been approached by young Air Force officers over the last week or so, asking what they can do. How do they lead their troops? How do they take care of their airmen? How do they take care of their cadets? And I think the first piece of advice I've tried to give is that they have to listen, that they have to understand that we all come to the Air Force Academy from a different lived experience. And so it's not enough to not be racist. You have to be anti-racist, and you have to read, you have to listen, and you have to care, because you have airmen out there that are hurting. You had National Guardsmen called to do their duty on their streets, and it was their cousin across the street protesting. So we have to be sensitive to the needs of the people we're supposed to lead. And so I'm happy that people were willing to reach out to me and to ask those difficult questions about how do you lead a diverse force.
And you actually make a good point. You talked about being someone who others felt comfortable enough to reach out to. And I found even in my own experience that I was kind of teetering on a line. I was dealing with my anger and my sadness and my grief, and a little bit of frustration that I often felt that many of my white colleagues or counterparts would always be reaching out to me to solve the problem or give them the answer. And so I towed the line a little bit, and it was unclear for me like what I should do early. T, to you, what are your thoughts about how other leaders of institutions, military in particular, can begin to address the issues of the current climate in the United States with their troops? And then what do you say to those who are either in the Air Force or outside the Air Force or even at the Academy now who are being approached constantly to be given answers after their ancestors have already bled, died, built this country, been through so much, but people are still asking Black cadets, Black airmen, and others for answers? How should they address that? And you're back on mute.
I'm going to get it here soon. Yeah, from a leadership perspective, it always starts from the top. And I'm very proud and happy to see CQ in his position, because in any organization, the CEO, or in this case, the chief, sets the tone. Having said that, I understand, and I think the Air Force should understand as well, particularly you know, our young airmen of color, that CQ can't wave a wand and change everything in the force. You're talking about 635,000 people. But that's where it starts. My classmate, who was chief of staff, a guy by the name of Norty Schwartz, we served on wing staff together. And Norty, a good man. When he became chief in August of '08, it was right when I became CEO and president of the AOG. In that fall, the 4-stars got together for their annual Corona conference here at the Academy. And I came out of my office and I looked down from the atrium into the room, and there was not one person of color around that horseshoe table, the table of power, or along the side of the walls, the staff folks. Norty came up during a break for an office visit, and I said, Norty, 35 years after we graduated from the Academy, and you're telling me that there's not one color who's qualified to sit around that table? It's all white men. And he bowed his head and kind of shook it, and he said, T, we just haven't done a good job of bringing people along. And then he went on to explain to me that there's a process, there's a system for how people move up and get to the higher levels in the Air Force, the right assignments and the right schools and the right qualifications. And I said, well, you're the chief now, do something about it. And he said, well, it's not quite that easy. Yes, I'm the chief, but I'm kind of first among equals. I said, but I'm going to hold you accountable. And he said, and I'm going to do my best. At the time, there were 12 4-stars in the Air Force, all white men. And I'll give Norty Schwartz credit. By the time he left 4 years later, there were 2 African-American 4-star generals and 1 woman. And so of the 12 4-stars, 25% had now been held by minorities, blacks and women. And that's what it takes, leadership from the top. And I am very hopeful and excited about CQ's possibilities.
I appreciate that. And as we talk about leadership, I think a lot about at the Air Force Academy, the establishment of the National Character and Leadership Symposium Conference. One of the things that many of my instructors told me before I left was that there wouldn't be a better school experience where I would be taught leadership. And inside of leadership, there's always, leadership has a foundation of philosophy, ideology, thought process, morality, the way that you look at things, the way that you think. And they were teaching us that at the Academy. In fact, on day 1, we had to have contrails out, pasted to our face, and we had to say things like, what are the Air Force core values, sir? The answer is integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. And what that sort of brings us to in this moment is a type of confusion, because many of us understand what integrity is. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's been drilled into us. And we oftentimes feel like we're in a space where we're working in an Air Force or in a world where those who are in leadership positions don't exercise that kind of integrity. And so with that, I kind of want to flip the conversation over to you, Ed. Can you talk about this concept of leadership being something that is taught, and then it's also something that is behaved in certain ways, it's acted upon, and how it's affecting those of us who look at our leaders and don't feel like we're always working in an environment where they're displaying that kind of leadership, and those Air Force core values seem to be off course. They're not the order of the day.
I like to talk straight, and I'm going to cut to it. A closet racist lacks integrity. He's a liar, and he lies every day. A diseased institution suffering from systemic racism, it lacks systemic integrity. Integrity, I have a definition here. Integrity is the practice of being honest and showing a consistent and uncompromising adherence to strong moral and ethical principles and values. That's simple enough to understand. But I'm not going to define the word racist for you. I'm not going to fall into that trap. I've read enough sociology, enough critical race theory to know how difficult defining that word is. And I know how much smart people like to attack definitions. However, you define the word racist. A function of how someone thinks or a function of what someone does. Take your pick. You will likely define it as something bad, something immoral, something sinister. And I hope you define it as something unpatriotic as well, right? Any institution that has racists in its midst, but claims it does not tolerate racists, has at least one of three problems. Its members can't stop the racists from infiltrating its ranks. And if that's the case, you got a security breach. Or the institution's members can't find the racists. And if that's the case, you got a problem of incompetence. Or the institution members are lying to us when they say they do not tolerate racism. They're lying. And that's an integrity problem. That's the worst kind of problem. So any institution whose members lie about what they tolerate lacks systemic integrity. And if you lack systemic integrity, your institution isn't what you say it is. You aren't doing what you say you're doing. You're lying to everyone. Every Air Force Academy alumnus, every Air Force Academy alumna remembers the first part of our honor code. We will not lie, steal, or cheat, nor tolerate among us anyone who does, nor tolerate. That's a powerful honor code. And like Kate said, it does not expire. Once you make that pledge, that's your pledge to honor for your lifetime if you're a part of this institution, active duty or otherwise. So if you are a racist cadet, you are lying every day. If you're a racist officer, you are lying every time you put your uniform on. And if you tolerate racists, then you have, in my opinion, turned your back on our code. And you have lost your integrity. You need to find it. Because if you, the one who is supposed to make sure it's not tolerated, if you don't do that, then you allow the liars to lie. You allow your institution to fall apart. You allow its integrity to just disappear. And that's not what we were taught when I was a cadet here, and that's not what I believe our institution is about. So systemic integrity, I think, is the issue. And I think that if you have that, you will eliminate the systemic racism problem.
Thank you for that. And so on that note, you brought up the word tolerate a few times. And today, the Air Force Academy in particular, and it's the same in the Air Force, has a zero tolerance policy against a few things. Zero tolerance policies for incidents involving drugs, zero tolerance for sexual assault, sexual harassment, and many other conduct issues. What do we believe should happen to cadets or officers or others who display overt racism or racial aggression, racial harassment, racial assault? Because we have zero tolerance for those things, but there doesn't seem to be the consistent policy for zero tolerance of racism.
I would consider racism to be an honor code violation. Because in our institution, we pledge not to be that, not to do that. And we presume that everybody is living out their word, living out that pledge. So if you are a racist and you do racist things, to me, is dishonorable. And you're violating our honor code. You don't have integrity. You don't see people going around the Air Force Academy, for instance, talking about how much they think racism is a good thing. So if we have them in our midst, they're closeted. And that is dishonorable. They're lying. And if we identify them, they need to leave our midst, like everybody else who violates the honor code.
Kate, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
I'm not probably as harsh as Ed is. I believe and agree, but I also think when you bring 17 to 21-year-olds to the academy, they all come with different lived experiences, and some of them don't know that what they do or say is wrong. But I think it's incumbent upon the leadership at the academy, and I'll call out the SUP, the COM, the dean, the athletic department, that they need to teach cadets everything, whether it's teaching them the code, teaching them how to study, what's wrong. I find it amazing in 2020 that people don't know that blackface is offensive, but there are people who legitimately don't know it's offensive. There are people that grew up believing that women aren't as capable of men as men. They need to be disabused of that notion. So I'm willing, because it is a training environment, that I expect the leadership to teach and to train. You don't come to the academy knowing how to march and stand at parade rest. So I'm willing to say it's on the academy to teach and train and provide these opportunities to grow. But I don't know how many strikes you get. I don't know if you throw out juniors and seniors, but you give freshmen and sophomore a break. The honor code has honor probation. Do we need to establish racism probation? I don't know, but I think it's incumbent upon the leadership to teach and to train and to demonstrate how to be anti-racist.
T, your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I would agree with Catherine. Again, it's an issue of leadership, and it's also an issue of allocation of resources. Sexual assault is the perfect example. I mean, that became very important to the Air Force, to the services across the board. And they put a two-star general lady in charge of that effort. All of the academies these days measure sexual assault incidences each year. There's a report about it. And so there's no question about the elevation of that issue across the services. And I think race should be the same way. Put the resources behind it, put the leadership behind it. And when you speak from the top and people understand that they will be held accountable for progress in this area, then things will happen. If you know that your progression through the Air Force with respect to rank and promotion are affected by these issues, then you'll perform. A long time ago, I was very active with the American Cancer Society. I had served on the local board, the state board, and went on the national board for a number of years as well. And when I was chair of the state board, I told my CEO that I had three things that I wanted to accomplish during my tenure. The first was we wanted a new headquarters building because I'd been on the building committee for 10 years, and for one reason or another, we could never get that done. I wanted to institutionalize major giving. We were a $30 million operation, but our average donation size was $25. And so we were doing great on the grassroots level, but we weren't getting the big gifts. And the third thing I wanted to do was to institutionalize diversity in the organization. I said cancer is an equal opportunity killer, And I want to see people in this organization when I walk in the door that look like me. And not just at the secretary's desk, I'm talking about up to and including your senior management team. Now, the guy who was the CEO at the time and I were friendly. In fact, he and his wife and my wife would get together socially. And he was a good guy. But I told him, I said, Don, I said, this is business. Got nothing to do with our friendship. And whether you get a good evaluation or a pay raise, or whether you even here at the end of my time will be based on your performance on moving those 3 issues forward. And at the end of my 2-year term, we were in a brand new headquarters building. We had recruited the top fundraiser from Massachusetts General Hospital to be our fundraiser, who raised what in today's dollars would be $25 million to buy the new building, so we didn't have a mortgage on it. And he had a chief diversity officer who reported directly to him, and his CFO, chief financial officer, had been recruited away from the United Way, a gentleman who went on to become a CEO in another division at the American Cancer Society as well. Don understood clearly that these were my priorities and the board's priorities, and he had to perform, and he got it done. And I think that same attitude is needed at the highest levels of the Air Force, so that people understand that their careers, their paycheck will be dependent upon their performance around this issue of race.
Thank you for that. And I think and before we end tonight, I want to definitely come back to that to hear some more specific concepts of exactly how we could hold accountable and create those performance metrics. But you used the word that stood out to me, and you said institutionalize. And in order to institutionalize anything, of course, it comes with training, the things that Kate talked about from day one. They teach you everything. They teach you how to tie your shoes. They teach you how to make your bed. They teach you how to clean, right? So training, constant education. The other thing is the accountability, the actual performance metrics. Ed, I want to come to you and talk about this concept of institutionalizing the right kind of thinking. What sort of training, what sort of education, indoctrination needs to be brought to the table in order to make sure that our institution acts with a different type of institutionalization, for lack of a better word?
I think you have to build it into the professional military education. If professional military education is not about making sure our leaders have cultural competence, making sure that they understand and empathize with people who are not exactly like them, if that's not part of the professional military education now, it should be. We're taught everything that we need to know to be a military officer at the United States Air Force Academy. Among the things we need to know is how to deal with people unlike us, unlike the families we grew up in. And I'm talking about, what I mean by unlike, I don't mean that they put on their pants different. I mean that they might have different types of food. They might have different types of music they listen to, but in every other respect, they're exactly like us. But because we perceive those differences, we treat people differently, right? So leaders, especially military leaders in an increasingly diverse military, need to be trained on how to do the job of leading a diverse military well. I'm a big proponent of building in a course. I saw the change.org petition that was sent around. I think that's an excellent idea. I know that the next round of review for the curriculum here, I think is in 2021. Somebody needs to ask the hard question. Why isn't there a course on race in the core curriculum? Why isn't that part of the professional military education? It's going to be a hard question to answer in 2021 in light of what's happened this year. So I'm a big proponent of making that course core, and for two reasons. I think that it's going to ensure that the diverse cadets who are here are going to feel as though the institution respects and acknowledges their path to this place, and their peers who are in the majority. They're going to have a full and complete opportunity to have the difficult conversations, to learn, to become culturally competent, and they will have those tools before they leave this place. And we can guarantee that everybody has a baseline language, a baseline philosophy. And that in turn will help, I think, the institution make sure that they can spot racism, they can make sure that they can get rid of it. And if we are going to be merciful to those who don't get it, even after 4 years of training, make sure that they will retrain or re-educate whoever it is who still believes after graduating from this place that any form of racism is okay.
T, I want to bat that back to you. Do you have any ideas on how there could be performance metrics put in place to accommodate that, if you agree entirely with what Ed had to say about that?
Not really. And I say that from the standpoint of view of, I've been away from the Air Force system for a while. And I would leave that to the HR folks in the Air Force, leave it to the chief and his senior staff to come up with how they would measure that, what factors would come into play. But clearly, it can be done. I mean, we live in systems, whether it's an educational system, the healthcare system, the transportation system, the financial system. There's all around us systems that we have to deal with. And the Air Force has its systems as well. And so it's incumbent upon them to come up with the proper process in light of its systems to make sure that these issues are addressed. And I would leave it up to the chief and the air staff to do that.
Okay. And as you mentioned systems, I think about standards. I think about things that have been inculcated into the culture of the Air Force that affect things like promotions, the ability for people to move up the ranks. Earlier on, T, you had mentioned that you'd had a conversation with Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Nordy Schwartz, and you kind of gave a bit of his record on the number of 4-star generals and others we'd seen some market improvements. And even now, I think the Air Force Academy specifically has made great strides to create more diversity in the name of diversity and inclusion. I think at this point, I think it was last year, it was the second consecutive year that there were, I think about 50% of new entrants into the Air Force Academy were considered minorities in regards to ethnicity and gender. However, many cadets are still feeling like the Academy is not really an inclusive environment. And I come back to things like culture and standards. And Kate, I'll actually, we were talking a little bit earlier and you mentioned a few things that I want you to bring to the table. One of the things that, I don't want to say it's a claim to fame, but I feel like, there were, me and many of my classmates often found ourselves in many different situations based on sort of the perception of our conduct, whether it was the perception of how we walked, how we presented ourselves, perception of things like standard regs for hair. I don't have to do that anymore, clearly. But these things, sometimes these standards also have built into them things that we might see as systemic issues or bring about microaggressions or other things. Can you comment on that?
Thank you for that opportunity. One of the things that still is with me today, 40 years after it happened, was I came to the academy. I got my hair cut very short to be within regs. And throughout, by second BCT, it was probably out of regs. So they took me to the cadet beauty shop and they had someone to cut my hair that had never cut a Black person's hair before. It was the only time at the academy that I wanted to cry. And there's no crying at the academy. So I waited till I got back to my room, closed the door, and had a good cry. And that's a small segment of how do you welcome a person that looks like me into your Air Force when you don't sell hair products for my hair? You don't have people to tend to my Air Force reg, trying to be in regulation. I didn't see another Black woman officer, except for one, in my 4 years at the academy. So if you can't see it, you can't really believe in it. You know, I struggled at the academy. I couldn't swim. My grades, sometimes I was on the dean's list. Other semesters, I was on the dean's other list. And I didn't have someone that could shepherd me through that system. And you look for mentors and you look for mentees, and people tend to mentor people that look like them or seek out mentees that look like them. So I think that the one thing that the academy should be striving to do, and I think you can measure it, you can do surveys, you can ask cadets, have you seen things that are racist in your day-to-day? And so this year you have 100 issues of racism. Well, next year, is it down to 80 or is it up to 120? You can measure those things. You can hire a diverse cadre of AOCs. You can hire, and now that we hire civilian professors, you can hire professors that are Black, Indigenous, people of color. And you can measure those sorts of things. And I struggle because I don't think we should have quotas, but if you can boast about 30% of the incoming class are women, or 30% of the faculty women, if you can boast that 50% of the cadets are minorities, is 50% of the faculty minorities and diverse? Do we only see people that look like us in Department of Athletics, or are they in character and leadership roles? And so I think those are the things that we need to do.
Absolutely. And so on that, I want to shift just a little bit and kind of talk about, despite the many difficulties that, you know, you endured, Kate, that you might have endured, Ed, that I might say that I endured, and T, you know, coming through the Air Force Academy in the late 60s, early 70s, the same thing. But since then, all of you've done very well. I take the numbers of Nordy Schwartz. I look at the increased numbers of minorities coming into the Air Force Academy, and we see more officers. I mean, right now we have a chief of staff who is Black. There's just today, I think it was announced, there will be a woman, Joanne Bass, who will be Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force. And, you know, some will say, well, you know, we've had these incremental improvements, and actually things are so much better. I remember right after President Barack Obama was elected, they used to describe things. It's funny to hear it now, but we were describing America as post-racial America. And it was the notion that because of the success of these folks, it was proof that racism doesn't exist. And perhaps, you know, we can look at our policies and it's proof that none of us see color. And I want to read something really quickly before I throw it back to you. It's from the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And I'd actually asked a colleague of mine, actually one of my business partners, to read it. He's white, Terry Rice, he's white. And I was so angry. I kind of had this mental sort of orientation that I didn't need to read these books because, you know, I was already Black and I'd had these experiences, but I asked him to read it. So I said, I'd read it. And early in the book, it says a couple things I think I want to read. Denial is the heartbeat of racism, beating across ideologies, races, and nations. It is beating within us. Racist is not a descriptive word. It's a pejorative word. It is the equivalent of saying to someone that I don't like you. Therefore, there's always a group of us who are wanting to not be racist. The problem with not racist is a claim that signifies neutrality. I am not a racist, but neither am I aggressively against racism. But there is no neutrality in the racism struggle. The opposite of racist isn't not racist. It is anti-racist. Racist is not a pejorative. It is not the worst word in the English language. It is not equivalent of a slur. It is descriptive, and the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it, and then dismantle it. The attempt to turn this usefully descriptive term into an almost unusable slur is, of course, designed to do the opposite, to freeze us into inaction. And therefore, this common idea of claiming colorblindness is akin to the notion of being not racist. As with the not racist, the colorblind individual, by ostensibly failing to see race, fails to see racism and falls into racist passivity. The language of colorblindness, like the language of not racist, is a mask to hide racism. In a post-racial Air Force, whoever wants to answer this question, where we have a Black chief of staff, go ahead, Kate.
You know, I'm a lawyer, and I look at criminal justice statistics, and they just released a study showing that brown and Black airmen are more harshly punished for the same offense as their white counterparts. So if you're an E3 and you're Black and you do X, you might get this punishment. If you're an E3 and you're white, you might not get the same punishment. That's data, that's facts. So I think we have to look at those sorts of things. I think we have to look at data and do the surveys and acknowledge that we're an imperfect Air Force and we need to keep striving to do better and to do better. But just because one man has a job, it doesn't mean all of us have a good job. So kudos to the new chief. Kudos to the new Chief Master Sergeant. But just because one woman has a job, it doesn't mean all the other women in the Air Force are treated fairly. So I think we need to keep tallying things up and see where we fall short of the ideal.
Ed, I see the look on your face tells me you want to address that as well.
You know, when folks have this kind of conversation, they seem to want to forget about time. They seem to want to forget about the numbers of chiefs that there have been since there have been chiefs. We have the first in 2020. To begin a conversation saying that we are now colorblind when the first has just arrived in 2020, you are presuming that there is no built up backlog of problems with what's happened during the last couple of generations, right? So we are just now getting to the point where we're taking step one in many regards. That is not a colorblind society. When we have gotten to the point where we can say honestly, maybe after the 13th Black chief of staff in a row, maybe at that point we'll say, okay, hey, this must be a colorblind society. But one is not indicative of everything suddenly changing. Indeed, one is not going to fix any lack of systemic integrity that might still exist. So I don't buy that argument at all. And I know people like to make it, but I think it's just a non-starter. And I think it's a time-wasting approach to trying to address race.
Absolutely. T.
Yeah, there's a classic video. Some of you may have seen it. I can't remember where it was or who the lady was who was doing the presentation. She was a white lady speaking to an all white, if not a predominantly white, if not all white group. And she asked the question, how many of you would like to trade places with Black folks in America? And nobody raises their hand, right? And she mentions that fact. She says, I don't see anybody raising their hand. And so you must understand then what Black folks are going through, because none of you would want to change places with Black folks. So my question to you is, why then do you accept how they're being treated? And it's powerful. And the camera pans the room and you can see the look on people's faces. And so with respect to that issue of being post-racial, you know, I agree. It's a non-starter, it's a non-argument, because all you got to do is say, well, would you like to trade places with me? Or would you like to trade places with Trayvon Martin? Or would you like to trade places with George Floyd? And you won't get anybody that'll want to do that. And so that's how I deal with that issue when it comes up. And it is powerful because it gets people to thinking.
Absolutely. And so earlier on too, you had mentioned the concept of systems. And one of the things that I thought about the moment, and we're going to start to shift here to really start to get into actionable steps, things that we can do. We've got a few ideas already, but I want to wrap up kind of this conversation as you talked about system with a slight pushback. And it's kind of part of the conversation that I think we're having now, but some might say that as other people understand that these systems exist, and the goal would be for us to learn the system, operate within the system, and then achieve as a part of the system. It sort of assumes that the Air Force or the Air Force Academy is all the way out and out a meritocracy. And it somewhat ignores the fact that there are systemic issues like the concept of sponsorship, the concept of some of the unwritten rules that are responsible for success. Do you have any thoughts on that before we kind of transition to the next piece?
Yeah, there's no question at all that systems exist. I don't think that the system itself is necessarily, well, I would say straight up, it's not a racial system, but there's racism in the system. Now, when I went to school, and when I grew up as a young kid in South Carolina, there was a defined racial system, and there were rules around it, and there were laws around it. So for example, I couldn't go into the white-only bathroom. I couldn't sit at the counter at Woolworth's Five and Dime and get a milkshake. I couldn't go to school with white kids because that was against the law. That's systematic racism because it is structured, there are rules around it, and that's the way it is. Now, we fought hard to bring that system down, which we were able to change the laws, 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act. And so the systematic racism was eliminated, but you still have the vestiges of the system that remain. And in any system, you have that. It's extremely hard to change it. And even if you are successful in doing so, you still have to deal with the aftermath. And that's what we've been dealing with for the last 50 years. I had my 50th high school reunion this past year. But at the same time, particularly, and I'll shoot this out to our cadets of color that may be listening, young officers that may be listening this evening. You have to understand that there are systems and you gotta learn the system so that you can exploit it, so you can do those things necessary to navigate the system. And it may not be right that you have to do that, but it's how you move forward and do the best you can. And so, for example, and I'll use the Air Force and I'll move away from the race issue for just a moment and deal with something that is just a fact. Now, the Air Force has backed away from it. They don't want to talk about it these days, but the Air Force is still essentially a pilot's Air Force, right? And all you got to do is look at the chiefs of staff and see how many chiefs of staff have wings on their chest. You know, all you got to do is look at the 4-stars. And out of 11 4-stars, 8 of them are pilots. And all you got to do is look at who's in positions of power across the system. And it's clear, it's still a pilot Air Force. Now, when I was a cadet, it was the law, it was a rule. 85% of my class went to pilot training and 7% went to navigation training. And the 7% who went to nav training were probably cadets who had eye problems while they were here before they had surgery back in the day. And so that was their default position. Because back then, the rule was you had to be a pilot to command an operational, to to have operational command. Now that has since changed, okay? So the system has changed, and I can remember the exact day that it changed. I can't remember the date, but I can remember the day because I was instructor pilot out at Mather Air Force Base, which in those days was the navigation training school for the Air Force and other services, Coast Guard, Navy, etc. And it was as if the Berlin Wall had come down because the navigators were so happy that they were finally going to be in a position to have a navigator as the wing commander at the Air Force Navigator School. Because prior to that, it always had to be a pilot. So the rules changed, the system changed, but yet the vestiges of that system still exist today. And while it's gotten better, there's been some improvements, it's still a pilot's Air Force. Now they don't like to hear me say that, but that's just the reality. And all you gotta do is look around and see. And so consequently, if you're a cadet at the Air Force Academy today, a young officer, and you have that opportunity to go fly and you want to make the Air Force a career and you want to move up and try to reach the highest levels, then you ought to understand the system. Because the Air Force Academy produces 20% of the officer corps, but 50% of the general officers, okay? And so being an Academy grad gives you a step up long-term right away. And if you look around, if you're a pilot, you're gonna have a much better shot than anybody else. Doesn't guarantee you anything. There's still a lot of factors that come into play. Assignment, school, performance, etc. But if you look at the system, you take a step back and look at it, and you want to get to the top level, then those are the rules of the game. And all you gotta do is look around and see where the power is and mirror that. And if you start out on a different path, that's not to say that you can't get to that level, but it's gonna be much more difficult, in my opinion.
So as you spoke about this a little bit earlier and we had a conversation, you mentioned that there were people along the way who actually explained to you that there was a system and they explained to you that these are the steps that you must take. And that kind of brings me back to this concept of mentorship and of sponsorship, right? The notion that before you become a general officer, one of the unwritten rules is also that you will have to be sponsored. You know, I think you'd mentioned that 4 stars bring in the 4 stars.
4 stars make 4 stars, yeah. And if you look at the 4-star generals at their resume, bios, and you can just put a name in and the whole resume will come up. It's amazing how many of them have been either aide-de-camps or executive officers for 4 stars earlier in their career.
Right.
You see.
And so when we talk about mentorship and sponsorship, Ed, I think you had a pretty good idea, and I want to sort of move the conversation towards what are the action steps? What should we do? Last week, I had the opportunity to go back on YouTube and I watched a classic debate between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley at Cambridge. And James Baldwin gives, I mean, it is emotionally moving. It's factual. He gives an amazing speech on the condition of being Black in America. And William F. Buckley comes on and he actually gives some pretty good points himself. But one of the things that he brings up is, so what would you have for us to do? And in this case, he was saying, what would you have the white man to do? Because we understand that there's a concern, racism is an issue. There are ideas about being anti-racist and changing the institution, breaking down the system from beginning to end, hard as it may be. But what are those concrete steps? And so I'm gonna start with the end, and the last thing we talked about was mentorship, sponsorship. And Ed, I wanna pass it to you to talk about what sort of concrete things can we do to ensure that people have a pathway, and that there's someone who can explain to them what the system is and how it works, and then help them navigate it early on.
I mentor a lot of people, and I'm a big fan of mentorship. I also know the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. Those are very different things. And people who have been sponsored know what it means to be sponsored. Mentors give great advice. They're people you can call when you need to make a tough decision. But a sponsor is gonna put his or her reputation on the line for you. A sponsor is going to make a deal come together for you. A sponsor, in essence, is going to see to it that you achieve the goal. And that is how generals become generals. T's talking about these resumes. It almost appears as though somebody almost got a checklist together. It says, you know what? You're going to do each one of these things in these sequences. And guess what's going to happen at the end? You're going to have a star. It almost appears as though somebody's doing that for these folks. Somebody's being sponsored when they become generals. And we need more sponsorship in the military. There is a federal judge that I worked with years ago, developing a mentorship program that I thought was the most innovative approach that I'd seen to date. Her idea was to assign 3 people to one person. She wanted a young law student, a young lawyer, and a senior lawyer, all mentoring a student who might go to law school one day because they were undergrads. And this was such an innovative idea to me because I thought to myself, you know what, you're onto something. You have someone who is able to address almost every issue that this young person might confront at every stage between here and law school. It's a comprehensive solution. What I would do if I had the authority or the influence to do it is I would make sure that the Way of Life Committee sets up an organized mentorship program for all cadets. Every single cadet on the Hill should have, if they want, an opportunity to be mentored by somebody in the Way of Life Committee. We got enough members. But in addition to that, I would strongly encourage the field grade officers in the Air Force who love the Air Force the most, who love the country the most, to raise their hands to mentor Black cadets too. Because when a white field grade officer mentors a young Black cadet, there's going to be a two-way education. The white field grade officer is going to teach the cadet the system. They're going to teach them what social capital does in this institution. They're going to teach them the types of boxes they have to check to get to where they want to go. And they're going to, in exchange, have an opportunity to learn things from that cadet, those field grade officers. And I would hope by learning those things from those cadets, from those diverse cadets, they'll become even more effective leaders going forward. I think something like this would work extremely well, particularly if the two weren't in the same chain of command. So that kind of overlap, that kind of mentorship from different angles, from people who see the Air Force differently and experience it differently, that's the kind of rich level of mentorship that I think we should try to give to Black cadets. Now, that's what I would do if I had the resources and I could get a whole bunch of people on board. Get a bunch of white field grade officers to mentor Black cadets and get Way of Life alumni to mentor Black cadets, and maybe even get 4 degrees mentored by 2 degrees and first degrees, which is already happening.
Absolutely. Kate, you had mentioned earlier, and actually I'll recap really quickly some of the ideas that we've put out. Ed, you mentioned education courses, right? So a real curriculum on anti-racism and a real training program that ensures that instructors and others who are working at the Air Force Academy have this kind of training and understanding to be culturally competent. The next thing I had heard about was also hiring. Kate, you mentioned we need to hire more instructors that are Black and other people of color. We need to hire across the board on gender. The same thing has been happening, and we have seen in the last few years a lot of improvements in the admissions process. And so there's specific metrics that need to come from that. So metrics in hiring, metrics in admission, metrics in education courses, metrics in anti-racism education. And then what Ed just brought up was the actual opportunity to create a mentorship program, which can have specific metrics against numbers for the number of people who are being mentored, who are being sponsored, who are being reached out to across the board. What other ideas do you have as we wrap up? What other sort of specific action steps can the institution take? What will we have for them to do? And I'll begin with you, Kate, and then I'll go T, and then end with you, Ed, and we'll start to wrap it up.
You know, one of the things that I was fortunate enough to do when I lived in Denver was to be a squadron ethics advisor. And General Silveria said, you know, every one of you can give something back to your academy. And I didn't have a great academy experience. I'd like to say I survived it, and it prepared me for the rest of my life. But I took Jay at his word, and I said, this is something I could do. I could come and talk to cadets every other week about ethics and the law and expectations. And I think I made a bigger impact on white cadets to see a Black graduate in a position of responsibility, authority, because they don't see it either. So I think at the same time, those of us on the Way of Life Committee as alumni, we need to give back to our academy, and we need to be a resource for young white officers and cadets as well. So I think we need to reach out a little bit more. The academy needs to help foster these relationships, to reach back. If you ran track at the academy, volunteer with the track team. If you did robotics at the academy, volunteer with the Astro Club. Each of us has a way to give back, and the academy should facilitate those sorts of relationships as best they can.
Okay. T, your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, I would echo Kate's remarks and Ed's. In fact, I think Ed's suggestion about the mentoring program is absolutely brilliant. And so kudos to you on that idea, my friend. Finally, I would just reach out to the suit and say, suit, you're the person with 3 stars up there. You do need to have more AOCs, more people in the comm shop, more people, particularly in the DF side, because I can acknowledge during my 9 years there as AOG president, I would see Black AOCs and Black, what do they call them, AMTs, the enlisted folks in the squadrons, there to perform their duties, but also be mentors as well. But very seldom did I see anybody at DF. Now, I don't know what the constraints are. I understood by word of mouth that the commandant had more flexibility with respect to picking their folks down at MPC or getting the kind of people in that they wanted. But to Kate's point, particularly with respect to the fact that we have the civilians on the faculty now, but not only them, Air Force officers as well. I think DF has a lot to do. And I think that's an area and an issue that you can address directly because you're running the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So we've got hiring practices being well tracked on the side of AOCs, AMTs, and then making a specific effort to change what's happening inside of DF and to increase the number of Black professors, professors of color across the board with a breadth of experience coming into DF. Ed Hopkins, your take on what are some specific action steps?
You need more Black faces, and I'll tell you why. You need more Black faces in leadership positions. And the reason why is because of prestige. We all know in our gut what prestige is. We feel it, we experience it. When you see people in high places, you assign notions of prestige to them. When you see the absence of yourself in those high places, what happens? Who are you assigning prestige to if you don't see someone who looks like you? Well, you're assigning prestige to everybody else but you, but what you see in the mirror. So it is important to double down on efforts to recruit the most talented, diverse faculty, the most talented, diverse leadership and staff that the Air Force Academy can get. And that is where you start. You just double down on recruiting the talented ones. There's not a paucity of people who can come in and do it that are diverse. They're out there. There may, however, not be enough doubling down when it comes to going out there and getting them. So what you need to do is you need to go get more of the most talented people in the world, diverse, and bring them here so that these cadets can see faces that look like theirs and absorb that kind of concept of prestige from those faces. That's very important. And if you continue to have these types of environments where you have no or very few diverse people in high places, you're sending a message whether you like it or not. You're telling diverse people something whether you like it or not, whether you intend to or not. And you're telling them that that's not for them. And that's why you got to go out there and find the folks to put them in those positions so that you can send a different message.
Thank you all. And so what I want to do now is just say thank you to each of the panelists. Kate, T, Ed, I greatly appreciate you taking the time to do this out of your busy schedules. The other thing, I just want to continue to acknowledge that all of you have served for me, and just Rashad talking, all of you have served for me as an example, and have helped me think through what it is that I need to get through on a regular basis, because I know that people like me were part of this history, part of this long blue line. And before I hand it back over to you, Lloyd, and you can get ready to come back on, or I'm not sure if it's Joy. Real quickly, a couple years ago, I was back at the Air Force Academy, and I had a chance to sort of walk the terrazzo and walk through Fairchild Hall, and I looked at pictures on the wall, to this point, Ed, about seeing yourself. And I was happy to see the few faces that some folks that I actually knew, Chris Howard, Rhodes Scholar, saw his face on the wall, and others. But before this year, of course, Flash Wiley he was to be inducted as a distinguished graduate this year. But it was I told the story about things that I had heard about Flash, who happened to be with us this evening. And I told a story about Flash being Lance Peter Syjon's roommate, because Lance Peter Syjon was the only person who was willing to room with Flash at a time when Flash was coming through the academy. And so it was that kind of conversation, along with many other things, that helped me to remember that I'm not just a cadet too. I'm not just a graduate also. That the history that I live with, that is part of me, I helped to create that history. I'm part of that history. And if not for all of you going before me and then living out your best lives, being so successful, setting the trail for us to understand that you could be the beacon, the lighthouse, and we could do that without seeing your faces and being connected to you, that could have been lost. And so I appreciate all the efforts that you all have put in. To Joy and to Lloyd, I appreciate all of the work that you've done to pull this together, to get these great minds on this call tonight. And with that, I hand it back to you.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So my name is Joy Johnson. I am in the USAFA class of 2013, and I'm the Way of Life Alumni Group Vice President. First, I would like to give our moderator and our panelists a huge thank you for sharing their personal and professional experiences with us today. It was quite interesting to hear that our panelists' academy experience was not so pleasant, but yet they are still here giving back today. Their perspectives were critical to the conversation, and we definitely chose the right team to get our message across. As the Way of Life Alumni Group President mentioned earlier in his opening remarks, today's goals were simple. First, acknowledge. Acknowledge there is an issue. We cannot get far without acknowledging a problem even exists, much like the Academy and the OODA Loop. The first two components of it is observe and orient, and that's what we did today. So now that we acknowledged it, we're in a position to take action. We discussed kind of some realistic and achievable actions that we can implement tomorrow, and for most of them, it will take some time. But that is okay, and we're okay with that. Last but not least, the advocacy. We as alumni have a voice, but our voice can only go as far as the leadership in position is willing to hear us. We are happy to say that the USAFA leadership has made it clear that our voices have been heard, and we are proud to partner with the USAFA Superintendent, General Severia, and his team to create real change. Not Band-Aids, but institutionalized change. Their advocacy is essential in creating a true and diverse
a true, diverse, and inclusive Air Force that we all deserve. It ultimately begins with our future leaders at our premier leadership laboratory, the United States Air Force Academy. Our desired outcomes will focus on the education curriculum, cadet disciplinary system, and the culture at USAFA that by nature lacks inclusion. We are positive we will see change. And we look forward to keeping each of you engaged as we go through this journey together. Again, thank you to the participants and our audience, and especially the Association of Graduates and the Air Force Academy Foundation for hosting us. We look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. Awesome. Have a great night.